In this module, we will be studying about interest rate. In an economy, basically, there are two classes of people, one who have surplus funds in the form of savings from their current income, and the other who have deficit, who are surplus spenders and have deficit funds. Therefore, there is a interaction between the deficit spending units, which are the households, and the surplus spending units, which are the firms. So, the savings from the households are transferred to firms, which then invest these funds. Therefore, the financial system, the financial markets are responsible for transferring these funds from the deficit spending units to the surplus spending units. Interest rate is a charge on borrowing money, or if we view it from the other perspective, it is the reimbursement for the service and risk of lending money. Without this, the incentive that people should have to lend their money would not exist. They would be reluctant to lend and save money. Since interest rate is a cost to the borrower and a return to the lender, it affects both the borrowing and lending, and in turn it affects saving as well as investment. Apart from this, it is also important for the portfolio of the savings and the selection of projects. So, portfolio of savings on the part of the savers, who are the households, and the portfolio of or the project selection by the investor, who in this case are the firms. The financial markets are carrying out this transfer of funds, and then there are all these other dimensions which are related to the financial markets and in turn to the interest rates. It also affects international capital flows and the distribution of income. After studying this module, you would know about interest rates, the factors that influence interest rates, also the determination of interest rates under the classical, neoclassical and the Keynesian approaches. First of all, let us consider the theories of determination of interest rate. The classical theory was propounded by Ricardo, Hume, Fisher and others. As explained, the rate of interest is a real phenomenon in the sense that it is determined by real factors. It is for the supply of savings and the demand for investment. And through saving and investment, the equilibrium where saving and investment are equated, there the rate of interest is determined. The aggregate saving is the gap between the total national income and the total consumption expenditure, and the savings may be affected by individuals, households, businesses and governments. Current income, there is a natural normal tendency on the part of economic units to spend income on the present consumption, and there is a time preference for present consumption rather than postponing consumption to the future. And to the consumers, businesses and government, money now is not the same thing as money next year. So, the money is valued more today when you have it in your hand. Because of this time preference, it is necessary or desired that the current consumption, if postponed, if there is a sacrifice of current consumption, then various economic units could be induced to undergo this sacrifice and save if they are offered a reward for such action. This reward is known as the rate of interest. Thus, rate of interest is the reward for the sacrifice or the abstinence or the waiting involved in the act of supplying savings. Interest rates are ultimately involved and related with the role of time in economic activities and in the lives of economic units. They arise out of, and in a sense they measure, the preference for the present over the future. Irving Fisher particularly emphasized time preference or impatience or waiting or abstinence as the factor limiting the supply of savings. The existence of time preference hence explains the structure of interest rates. For greater savings, higher the interest rate is to be offered. There would be no savings at zero rate of interest, and greater the savings, greater would be the inducement offered, and then at higher and higher rates of interest, therefore there would be more savings forthcoming from the deficit spending units or the household sector. On the demand side, firms and other economic units demand capital to make profit by investing in producer goods. The investment takes place because by investing in a roundabout or indirect method or process of production, the economic units expect to obtain more in terms of the output, and therefore in future the consumption could be increased. The opportunity to produce more effectively by using roundabout methods of production determines the investment demand. While the saving schedule is upward sloping, the investment schedule is downward sloping, and obviously the equilibrium rate of interest is determined by the interaction of the savings and investment schedules in the economy. The classical view regards interest as being determined by the demand and supply, the productivity of capital goods providing the main elements of demand, and the supply being restricted by the disinclination to abstain from present consumption so as to do more savings. The rate of interest so determined is variously known as the natural rate of interest, full stock equilibrium rate, the classical real rate of interest, or the true real rate of interest. In a static situation, this rate is unaffected by money and price level because fluctuations in the quantity of money lead to a proportionate change in all prices, leaving the ratio of money yield to money principal unchanged. Interest rates are not affected by the behavior of banks or other credit institutions. Now, we come to the next theory, that is the loanable funds theory. It is an extension of the classical saving investment theory of interest rate. It incorporates monetary factors with non-monetary factors along with saving and investment. The theory was propounded by Wicksell, D.H. Robertson, and several other Swedish and British economists. According to the loanable funds theory, the rate of interest is determined by supply and demand of funds in the economy at that level at which the two, demand and supply, are equated. Thus, it is a standard demand and supply theory applied to the market for loanable funds, that is credit, treating the rate of interest as the price per unit of time of using or deploying or demanding or supplying such funds. The theory is based on the given simplifying assumptions. The market for loanable funds is one fully integrated, not segmented market characterized by perfect mobility of funds throughout the market. Perfect competition exists in the market so that each borrower and lender is a price taker and only one interest rate prevails in the market at any given point of time. The forces of competition make this rate the market clearing equilibrium rate. The theory has used partial equilibrium approach, under which all factors other than the rate of interest that might influence demand and supply of loanable funds are assumed to be held constant. In other words, it assumes that the rate of interest does not interact with other macroeconomic variables. In its popular form, the theory is stated in flow terms, considering flow of demand and supply of funds per unit of time. As such, the theory hypothesizes that it is the flow equilibrium of loanable funds which determines the rate of interest. Given these assumptions, the determination of rate of interest is easily explained once the demand and supply of loanable funds is specified. At this point, the loanable funds theory is claimed to be an improvement over the classical saving and investment theory of rate of interest, since besides real factors, it also takes into account hoarding and dishoarding and increases in the money supply in its analysis. In this sense, it combines both the monetary and non-monetary factors. The supply of loanable funds, which is LS, is usually taken to be equal to S plus DH plus delta M. So, here S is the aggregate savings from all households, firms, net of their dissavings, DH is the aggregate dishoarding of cash, and delta M is the incremental supply of money. Following the standard economic theory, both S and DH are hypothesized to be increasing functions of rate of interest. Delta H is assumed to be autonomous, and LS is also an increasing function of rate of interest. The demand for loanable funds, which is LD, is given by LD is equal to I plus delta MD, where I is the gross investment expenditure and delta MD is the incremental demand for money hoarding. The following standard economic theory has both LD and so the components of LD, and the total LD is hypothesized to be a decreasing function of rate of interest. The equilibrium rate is determined as the level of LD, which is a function of R, is equal to the level of LS, which is again a function of R, and R is the rate of interest. We know that supply of loanable funds is upward sloping and demand for loanable funds is downward sloping. Therefore, I plus delta MD is equal to S plus DH plus delta M. In contrast to the classical theory, where the equation for the equilibrium condition is I, which is a function of R, is simply equal to S, which is a function of R also. The two equations are shown diagrammatically, which shows directly only LD, LS, I and S as functions of the rate of interest. Delta MD is not shown here, but it can be derived as the flat distance between LD and I. This gap increases as the rate of interest declines because delta MD is hypothesized to be a decreasing function of rate of interest. The straight distance between LS and S lines show the sum of DH and delta M. This distance is shown to increase with an increase in the rate of interest as delta M is taken exogenously given and DH is hypothesized as an increasing function of the rate of interest. The equilibrium between LD and LS yields an equilibrium rate of interest R1, whereas the saving investment equilibrium of the classical theory will yield a rate of interest whose equilibrium rate would be R2. So, all of this shows that according to classical theory, we may have a different rate of interest, and according to the loanable funds theory, where LS and LD intersect, the rate of interest may be lower, and in fact the total quantity of money may also be higher because both LS and LD are substantially placed outward of I and S because of the additional factors which are monetary factors. Now, let us come to Keynesian theory. In his book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, John Maynard Keynes gave a new view of interest. So, there have been many interpretations, but basically what Keynes says is that interest rate is a purely monetary phenomenon and it is determined by the demand and supply for money. According to him, the interest is a reward for parting with liquidity for a specified period of time. Some people prefer liquidity or want to hold money to meet their various motives. They need to be paid for some reward for surrendering, and liquidity and money are both used interchangeably in this context, and this reward is the rate of interest, and that must be paid to them in order to induce them to part with liquidity or money. Mind you, here we are not talking about saving an investment, we are talking about liquidity or money. Further, according to Keynes, the rate of interest is determined by liquidity preference, demand for holding money, and the supply is known as both these phenomena lead to the determination of the rate of interest, and on the demand side, whatever we have so far discussed could be also called liquidity preference. Therefore, the Keynesian theory is also known as the liquidity preference theory. Hence, it is through the rate of interest that the demand and supply of money affect the level of economic activity. If money demand is equal to money supply, and on the other hand we have other factors, that is rate of interest, investment, income, employment, marginal product of labor, price level, wage rate and so on, then all of these factors are also related to the rate of interest. The demand for money in a two-asset economy can be explained with the help of the interest rate and the level of income. Keynes has assumed that there are two forms of assets, money in the form of currency, notes and coins and demand deposits in banks, and long-term bonds, and the interest rate and bond prices are inversely related. The demand for money depends upon how they decide, that is the holders of money decide their balance of their portfolio between money and bonds. Of course, it stands to reason that bonds could be both long term and short term, but generally we treat it as short term bonds. Let us continue with the interest rate determination. Keynes's liquidity preference theory here, as we have been saying, according to Keynes, people wish to hold money, and therefore the demand for money can be divided, or the motives for holding money can be divided into three motives: transaction motive, precautionary motive and speculative motives. Transaction motive is the motive for holding money for spending on day-to-day expenditures, day-to-day activities, the goods and services that we consume, that a household consumes. So, a certain part of the income has to be set aside as a cash holding for such expenditures. On the other hand, we have the precautionary motive, which is often to be set aside as a cash balance, which is to be used for unforeseen circumstances like illness, or if a guest arrives, or for travel, or so on. So, for such precautionary purposes also people wish to hold money, they wish to hold a part of their income as a cash balance. So, if we put together the transaction motive as well as the precautionary motive, then we could define one part of money demand as M1. Therefore, M1 is equal to L1 within brackets Y, which means that M1, which is the money demand for holding money for transactions and precautionary purposes, is a function, that is L1, a function of Y, which is income. Speculative motive, this is rather complex. Speculative motive is desired by, or the speculative balances are held by the households who don't want to keep their entire income as an idle cash balance, but still they would like to hold some amount of their income in the form of a cash balance, which could alternately be either kept for speculative purposes for buying bonds, or could be reconverted back from the holding of bonds back into cash when you sell the bonds. So, speculative motive is basically based on the relationship between bond prices and rate of interest. It is known that bond prices and rate of interest are inversely related to each other. If bond prices are likely to rise, then the rate of interest is expected to fall. People would purchase bonds to be sold when the prices rise later. So, this is speculative motive. Though if bond prices are expected to fall, the rate of interest is expected to rise, and people will sell the bonds to evade losses in the future. So, according to Keynes, the higher the rate of interest, lower will be the speculative demand for money, for holding money, and lower the rate of interest, higher would be the speculative demand for holding money. Therefore, M2, which is the second component of money demand, is given as M2 is equal to L2 within brackets R, which means that speculative demand for money is a function of rate of interest, and its relationship with rate of interest is negative. Geometrically, it is of course different from M1. M1 does not depend upon rate of interest. Therefore, whatever be the rate of interest, the M1 function, which is a function of y, will always remain vertical. But if we talk about M2, then it is downward sloping, but at the same time it is not a straight line. It is a smooth curve, it is a hyperbola which goes down from left to right, and as it goes down from left to right, the curvature goes on becoming flatter and flatter. Now, if the total liquidity is given by M, then it is equal to M1 plus M2. Hence, M is equal to M1 plus M2, M1 is a function L1 of Y, M2 is a function L2 of R, and the total liquidity preference or money demand is given by M is equal to L within brackets Y comma R, which means money demand is a function of liquidity preference which is dependent on both income and rate of interest. Coming to the supply of money, the supply of money refers to the total money or the quantity of money. However, the supply of money is a function of rate of interest to some extent, yet it is taken to be fixed, and it is taken to be a fixed amount which is released by the monetary authorities, the central bank. Hence, the money supply curve is taken to be perfectly inelastic with respect to the rate of interest. It is a vertical straight line. The determination of rate of interest, like the price of any product, the rate of interest is determined as the level at which the demand for money and the supply of money are equal to each other. The vertical line QM shows the supply of money, and L, the total demand for money, or M, which is equal to L, you could call it liquidity preference or money demand, is downward sloping, and this is obtained by adding M1, which is vertical, to M2, which is downward sloping. Now, the total demand is equal to the money supply, and both the curves intersect at E2, and the equilibrium rate of interest is OR. Now, you could clearly see that at this point, at E2, the money supply is QM, and the downward sloping money demand function L is curved, it has a curvature, and it is downward sloping from left to right, and at any other point E1 or E2, what you find is at E1 there is excess supply, and therefore the rate of interest R1 is likely to fall to R. At E2 there is excess demand, and therefore the rate of interest is likely to rise from R2 to R. So, whenever there is either excess supply or excess demand, respectively either fall or rise, and finally equilibrium will be established where the equilibrium rate of interest is OR. At this point you could notice that on the x-axis money supply is equal to money demand. So, this is how the equilibrium rate of interest is established, and now let us consider the money demand curve, and the demand curve very clearly is downward sloping. It has a curvature which we have just now talked about, and at a given level of national income we can draw a given money demand curve. But of course, if the national income increases, then there would be an increase in M1. We are able to see how this leads to the entire money demand curve shifting from LP1 to LP2, liquidity preference schedule 1 to liquidity preference schedule 2. This is a horizontal shift to the right, and the gap between the two represents the increase in the money demand due to transactions and precautionary motives, which is M1. Now we come to the determination of the equilibrium in the money market. What we can see is that there is a vertical money supply curve MS, there is a money demand curve LP, which is downward sloping. So at point E we have the rate of interest as 10%. At this point money supply and money demand are equal, and if the rate of interest goes up to 12%, then there is excess supply, and if the rate of interest goes down to 8%, there would be excess demand. On the whole, what will happen is, as long as money demand and the money supply schedule remain the same, the rate of interest would continue to be the equilibrium rate of interest, which is shown to be 10%. Now imagine that there has been by some reason an excess money demand in the economy, then the Reserve Bank, the central bank, it decides to increase the money supply from MS to MS prime, and therefore we arrive at a new equilibrium point where the quantity of money demanded and supplied increase from N to N prime, and the equilibrium rate of interest goes down from R to R prime, such that the equilibrium shifts from E to E prime. It goes down towards the right along the money demand function. Now we will discuss about the factors affecting the interest rate determination. Economic growth changes the economic conditions, because of which there could be a shift in the demand schedule, and excess of loanable funds, which would affect the equilibrium rate of interest. Consequently, businesses identify more projects that are worth pursuing, and they are willing to borrow more funds. And similarly, what we can see is that the overall anticipated effect of the raised expectations by business is an outward shift of the demand schedule, and no obvious change in the supply schedule occurs. This is because there is an increase in the equilibrium exchange rate. Inflation will also affect the rate of interest. Higher the rate of inflation, more the interest rates are likely to rise, and this occurs because the lenders will demand higher interest rates as compensation for decrease in their purchasing power of money, and they wish to be future. To see it otherwise, changes in the inflationary expectation can affect the interest rate by affecting the volume of spending by households or by businesses. Decisions to spend affect the amount saved and the amount borrowed, that is the supply of loanable funds and the demand for loanable funds. Monetary policy. Central bank can affect the money supply, increase or reduce the money supply, and therefore when a central bank increases the money supply, it increases the availability of investable funds or loanable funds, and it places downward pressure on the rate of interest. The same logic can be applied in the case of a reduction in the rate of interest. Budgetary deficit. A higher federal government deficit raises the extent of loanable funds demanded at any prevailing rate of interest, causing an outward shift in the demand schedule. Assuming no offsetting increase in the supply, the interest will rise. Now let us summarize what we have done in this module. Interest is the price paid for borrowed funds. The price is generally expressed as a percentage per unit of time, and this is normally per year. And so the classical theory asserts that rate of interest is determined by real factors, which is savings and investment, savings are the supply of capital and investment is the demand for capital, and therefore it is saving and investment which determines the rate of interest. Loanable funds theory, in addition to saving and investment, also introduce loanable funds, that is the monetary assets, but the nature of the functions, that is the supply of loanable funds and demand for loanable funds, are not radically different from the savings and investment function. On the whole, although monetary factors are included, the monetary factors are not really effective and the equilibrium takes place through the real factors. In the case of Keynesian theory, we encounter what is called liquidity preference theory, and here Keynes says that interest is a purely monetary phenomenon. It is determined on the basis of demand and supply of money. Supply of money is obviously, it comes from the central bank, and demand for money comes out of three motives for holding money: transaction motive, precautionary motive, and speculative motive. Transactions and precautionary motive are both positively related to the income level, and rate of interest is negatively related to the money demand. All put together, money demand function slopes downwards to the right, it has a slight curvature, and money supply function is vertical. They both intersect to give us the equilibrium rate of interest.